Silver Darlings. Written by L.K. Wilde. Narrated by Royana. Prologue. All corners of the island heard the screams. New life fighting its way into the world, with force and ferocity equal to any gale which battered its shores. Souls teetered, and Bill prayed this would not be an exchange. One life for another. Anna's face twisted in agony, and sweat deadened her hair, leaving it tangled like seaweed against her pillow. With his hand clinging to hers, Bill forced his eyes away from the dark stain of blood beneath his wife and willed her to fight on. An unearthly scream tore the air. As its echoes faded, a smaller cry filled the silence. Bill looked on as the nurse placed a bloodied, bruised parcel of flailing limbs onto his wife's breast. Anna lifted a protective arm around the bairn, and Bill's beard soaked with the happiest tears. With one hand steadying herself against a wall, Rose lifted the other to her mouth and stifled a scream. A tide of pain ebbed and flowed, like waves in the distance. Feet spread wide, she rocked her body, allowing it to follow its own well-trodden paths. She removed her shawl, her body hot against the crisp, cool night, and looked towards the cottage. No one came, and she steeled herself to make it through alone. A wave of pain coursed through her, and Rose let a wild cry escape into the night sky. Something slipped from between her legs. She reached down and wrapped the creature in her shawl. Rose held the bairn close, offering him a breast onto which he latched. As she stroked him down, a tiny hand curled around her thumb. With the bairn content, she pulled the gutting knife from her waistband and hacked at the cord that held him to her. Rose hobbled back to the cottage, the bairn in her arms. The older ones were sound asleep, and Alex lay passed out by the fire, an empty ale jug kicked over by his feet. With the tiny boy placed in a basket, Rose eased her aching body into a chair and returned to the net she had been mending. The Island. Chapter 1. January 1900. In the cramped space beneath the table, Jimmy hugged his knees to his chest to stop them shaking. "It'll be fun," Clara promised, as she dragged him through the legs of islanders and into their hiding place. "I dinna like this. Don't be such a scaredy cat, Jimmy Watson." Jimmy stared at the booted feet of his da. Alex slumped lower in his chair, his legs inching closer to Jimmy's face. "That's me, ma'am," Clara whispered, pointing to small, well-polished boots. Jimmy's eyes bulged as Anna shifted in her seat, and her skirt rose to show a pair of delicate ankles. Clara giggled. "Shush," said Jimmy. His body shook, legs banging against Clara's back, like sticks on a drum. The tree-trunk legs of his mam whipped across and kicked her husband's shin. If things were turning ugly, it didn't bode well for him. "Ugh, what's that?" A puddle of liquid crept to the edges of Clara's skirt. Face burning, Jimmy saw dampness spread across the front of his trousers. Clara shrieked and bolted out from beneath the table. Light poured in as the cloth lifted and 4 grown-up faces stared. Dirty fingers reached for Jimmy, grabbing a handful of thick curls and yanking him out by the hair. He stumbled, sending glasses and plates spilling across the crisp white cloth. Before Jimmy could steady himself, Alex Watson hauled him towards the door. Children sniggered. Men looked away. Women tutted or smiled in sympathy. Jimmy screeched as his feet lifted from the floor and hair ripped from his scalp. Their faces inches apart, the acrid stench of liquor filled the air between him and Alex. Flecks of saliva shot from Alex's curled lips as he spoke. "Get yourself back home. I'll deal with you once I'm back." Jimmy hit the ground. Gravel tore his skin, and the hall door slammed. From beyond it came sounds of celebration. He brushed himself off and crept to a window. Even on tiptoes, he couldn't see in. He dragged a creel from the nearest yard, climbed up and peered through the glass. The hall was lit by a warm glow. Women busied themselves serving food, and the landlord of the Crown was doing a roaring trade from his barrel. Clara sat on her mam's lap, heads nestled together, their auburn hair a perfect match. A stab of jealousy hit Jimmy as he watched them. His own mam was chasing after his sisters, dragging them to sit beside her. After Jimmy's disgrace, she would keep a close eye on her bairns. On the makeshift stage stood old John, readying himself for a song. In one corner, children huddled, comparing treats gathered from their earlier door-to-door hogmanay. Jimmy jumped down from the creel. His skin prickled beneath sodden trousers, and the wind had a fair bite as it whistled through his thin shirt. He shuddered. Opaque cottages huddled against a dark sky. Nets hung low like cobwebs, stacked creels like monsters guarding scuffed doors. The village streets filled with eerie wind song, and Jimmy remembered his sister's tales of ghosts. They claimed they had seen a robed monk walking through the ruined priory, and swore a Viking had called to them from the shore. From the corner of his eye, Jimmy saw a lurking shadow and sprinted to his cottage. The fire had burnt out. The small room lay in darkness. Fear of Alex eclipsed any fear of the night, and he stepped out into the yard, removing his trousers and washing them in a bucket. He sniffed them to be certain they were clean, then hung them behind the privy, out of sight, and he hoped out of mind. It was freezing in the cottage. Jimmy lay on a mattress and pulled rough blankets up tight. The shivering was incessant. No amount of blankets could still his trembling limbs. Like a caged animal, he stayed alert, jumping with every creak in fear that Alex had returned. Joyful shouts filled the streets as islanders made their way to the watch night service. By midnight, he was still awake, welcoming the dawn of a new century with a deep sense of dread. Chapter 2. February 1905. Clara bent over a basket, placing the baited line down in neat rows, to be sure it would not tangle. On a low wooden stool sat her mam, threading thousands of slippery mussels onto a line with speed and ease. Anna's complexion displayed none of the lines that exposure to the elements should have brought. Back straight and waist slim, Clara thought she looked more like her sister. The only sign of the life she led were her hands, their skin chapped and raw. Years of working with a fish knife had left scars in patterned white lines that zigzagged her palms. Mother and daughter hummed as they worked, only looking up when footsteps approached the cottage. Anna beamed as the wooden door creaked open, and a large, bearded man ambled towards them. Clara jumped up, throwing her arms around his waist. He reached down and stroked her hair before tilting her face towards his. "Been a good lass for Mammy," said Bill, smiling down at his daughter. "She has, most of the time," said Anna, walking over to kiss her husband's cheek. "Good catch today." "Aye, was reet enough. A good few cod on the lines and lobsters in the pots." Bill sat, pulling off his boots, then hanging his sou'wester on one of the many wool hooks. His enormous frame dwarfed the old chair, and it creaked as he lowered himself into it. Anna and Clara cleared away the lines and picked up their knitting. Bill threw another chunk of driftwood into the hearth. Its flames danced as the driftwood blackened, spreading a warmth through the cottage akin to that of the small family who lived within its walls. Soon the cottage filled with the sounds of wood crackling and the clinking of thin metal. Anna's needles flew at twice the speed of her own, but Clara knew she was improving. Last year she could only work on hems and cuffs, but this year she had begun work on her first gansey. Woven navy yarn spilled across the scuffed surface of the table, its patterns mirroring the nets and lines stored in the rafters above. Anna glanced over at her daughter. "Keep it tight." I'm trying." Her hazel eyes squinted and concentration played across her brow. In contrast, Anna barely looked at the needles in her hands, her fingers sure and steady. Clara studied her mam's technique, hoping her efforts would pay off. She wanted her dad to benefit the following winter as he braced himself against the freezing sea air. Clara rubbed her tired eyes with the heels of her palms and gazed around the room. Rag rugs warmed the stone-flagged floors, and a few precious ornaments littered the dresser beside her, hinting at a previous life Anna had left long ago. Clara yawned, the warmth of the fire seeping into her tired bones. "Time for bed," said Anna, glancing from her knitting while her slim hands worked. Clara stretched her arms high, yawned again, then bent to kiss her parents goodnight. In the bedroom, she pulled back the heavy curtain, which split the room in two. Her friends shared beds with at least 4 siblings, but as an only child, she had the space all to herself. Beneath her patchwork quilt, Clara pulled blankets tight to ward off the chilly night. Not long after, her parents retired, causing Clara to stir from her slumber. From behind the curtain came Anna's quiet breathing and Bill's low rumbling snores. Clara closed her eyes and fell back into her dreams, a contented smile playing on her lips. Chapter 3. March 1905. Jimmy trudged through the village streets. Every front door he passed had cairns of shells, nets and creels piled beside it. An icy wind whipped round him, and he quickened his step. He kicked open the door of his cottage, dumping an armful of broken nets beside it. While his eyes adjusted to the gloom inside, the squalls and shouts of female voices reached his ears.
"Where's your da?" said Rose. "Where do you think?"
Rose reached across the table and cuffed him around the ear.
"That's enough of your cheek, lad. Help me get the barren settled, then go fetch him. If he drinks away today's earnings, we won't survive the week."
Rose heaved herself off a chair that squeaked in relief as her weight shifted from it. She wiped the slime of bait onto her filthy apron and set about gathering up hordes of bairns. The baby sat hitting driftwood against the floor, her cheeks red raw from wiping snot across them. Jimmy's stomach twisted as he watched. He pitied the poor bairn, not yet old enough to walk out of the door and far, far away. Rose screeched at the feral bairns, and thin arms wrapped themselves round Jimmy's legs. A small face peered up at him. Even covered in grime, his sister shone with innocent beauty. He scooped the little girl up and kissed her filthy cheeks. "Hello, my little Marnie. How are ye doing today?" Marnie snuggled into his neck, stuck a dirty thumb in her mouth and began twirling his thick hair. Jimmy reached his hand round to her ribs and began tickling. His sister dissolved into giggles, squirming in his arms.
"Put the bairn down. I'll never get her to sleep with ye doing that,"
said Rose as one child became tangled in her long skirt and another tried to escape under the table. Jimmy winced as Rose pulled the little girl out by her foot, looking round for a slipper to give her a good hiding. With coaxing from Jimmy and threatening from Rose, they rounded up the bairns. Girls lay cramped on a stained mattress, struggling for a piece of rough blanket, before huddling together for warmth. His elder sisters had put up a fight, indignant they should go to bed before Jimmy, but Rose would not entertain their raging. When their breathing turned heavy, Jimmy crept over and looked at them. His sisters, all 7 of them, lay in a tangle of limbs, slumber and brief respite from the harsh reality of their waking hours. The eldest, Sally, had outgrown the mattress, and her stockinged feet poked out from beyond its edge. Even in her sleep, her mouth turned down at the corners. Jimmy's eyes moved across to Marnie. Precious Marnie. He tried his best to shield her from the worst of family life, but those enormous eyes saw. A harsh whisper snapped him from his thoughts. "Jimmy! Jimmy!" "Aye? Get your da back here. You know where he is." "Aye," he said, pulling his coat back on and heading out into the dark night. He knew where Alex was, the same place he always was. Inside the fisherman's arms, the smell of stale sweat, rotting fish and tobacco hit Jimmy hard. Bile rose in his throat. He swallowed it down and pushed through the gaggle of fishermen. Alex was at the far side of the room. Jimmy wasn't sure how old his dad was, but he couldn't be much over 30. He looked like an old man. Alex's head drooped forward, chin resting on his chest. A growing circle of saliva was forming on his gansy as he slumped unconsciously against a barrel. The hair on his head was thinning, and his cheekbones protruded like jagged fish knives. Men jeered as Jimmy put his arms around his dad and tried to heave him off the floor. Despite his thin frame, Alex was a dead weight. Try as he might, Jimmy struggled to shift him. Someone crouched beside him, and he turned to see Bill's large, bearded face looking at Alex in disgust. "Dinna fret, Jim lad. I'll help you," he said, adding under his breath. "You shouldn't be needing to do this, you know." Bill lifted Alex to his feet. Together they dragged him from the bar, his feet scratching a smooth trail into the sand and dirt as he went. Once the frosty air hit, Alex came to, flailing around, cursing and hollering into the night. Jimmy's face flushed as his dad stumbled towards home. "Sorry. Ta." Bill watched Jimmy melt away into the darkness. He gave a long sigh before turning to make his own way home. Jimmy drew closer to the cottage and saw Alex scratching at the door to find its handle. He reached across and opened it, Alex falling through and stumbling into a chair that crashed to the floor. Steadying himself against the upturned leg, Alex scowled at Jimmy, spat on the floor, then made his way to bed. Jimmy righted the chair as Alex lurched onto the bed and put a bony arm around his wife. Rose tried to bat it away with a rough, plump hand, to no avail. After using the privy and fetching himself a drink, Jimmy sat down on a scruffy chair by the hearth. He rested his feet on a stool and pulled a thin blanket over him. A few embers still glowed deep orange, bursting with sparks that crackled as they burnt themselves out. After a long day, Jimmy needed rest. He had long outgrown the cramped bed. It wasn't right sharing the floor with his sisters, who were turning from girls to women with every passing day. Besides, he enjoyed sleeping by the fire. He could sleep anywhere, and this was the only solitude he got. From over in the bed came muffled voices and Rose's sharp whisper of, "No!" But then it started up, the rhythmic creaking, the grunts of his dad. Jimmy grabbed his woolen hat from the table and pulled it down over his face, praying it would muffle any noise that might otherwise reach his ears. He was soon asleep, avoiding the thuds of a fist hitting Rose's soft flesh. He didn't hear the cries of the baby, shoved from the warmth of the bed into a box beside it, making room for the spindly man who didn't need the space. Chapter 4. April 1905. Clara stubbed the toe of her boot in the dirt, scattering earth and stones into the air. She hovered outside the schoolroom, contemplating whether the risk of playing truant would be worth the freedom. Mrs. McKinnon appeared in the doorway. Clara had left it too late to escape. She met the teacher's frown with a scowl and shuffled inside to take her seat. A butterfly mind flitting through thoughts and ideas was not conducive to concentration. Her right hand still bore the bruises of a ruler against her skin. White slipped across black as the teacher's chalk clicked and swirled against the board. Dough, gaunt, farce, serve, frame, mull, prune. Clara's mind soon drifted, soaring like the gulls she glimpsed through the tall windows. Click, click, click. Chalk in hand, the teacher rapped against her slate. Click, click, click. Clara gave a small jump and, looking down, realised her slate had filled with doodles. Birds, flowers, and boats. She looked up at Mrs. McKinnon. "Stand up, child!" The teacher's lilting Scots voice would have been pretty had it not housed such a hard edge. Clara stood behind her wooden desk. The teacher marched across the schoolroom and reappeared with the dunce's hat. She ignored Clara's pleading eyes, pulling the hat down on her head and instructing her to stand in the corner. Clara turned puce and tears stung her eyes. She would not cry. She would not cry. She would not. A fat tear slid down her cheek. With the sleeve of her dress, she scrubbed it away. Classmates sniggered. Time dragged on, minutes passing with agonizing sedateness. The dinner bell rang, and Clara walked out, head held high. Her composure lasted until she stepped into her cottage, where she unburdened her anger to the listening ear of her mam. Instead of offering comfort, Anna chided. "You must pay attention at school, my love. It's important for your future." "But it's so dull, and that Mrs. McKinnon is as mean as a witch." "I've met her a few times around the village, and she's always seemed very pleasant to me. I think it's you that's in the wrong on this occasion." Clara scraped her chair under the table and stormed outside. Too early to return to school, she paced the island paths, stomping out her anger, fueled by hatred of both school and teacher. She often stole glances at Mrs. McKinnon and concluded she was a miserable creature, dressed in black, hair pulled tight in an unflattering bun. She might have been pretty were her mouth not set in a hard line. Clara walked and walked. The sun tipped lower in the sky, and she realised she was in danger of being late. By the time she reached the village, her breathing was ragged and sweat dampened her hair. Outside her cottage, she crossed the street, ashamed of how she had behaved, but not yet ready to apologise. She found Jimmy with his sisters, finishing up some bread and salted fish. Clara's stomach growled at the sight of the children eating, and she realised she had missed dinner. "All right?" "Aye, I will be, as soon as I can leave the stupid school and evil miss behind." "You know she's only trying to help us. You could try listening in class, then maybe ye wouldn't get in trouble so often." "I don't know why you stick up for her." Jimmy sighed, threw his crumbs away for the birds and kissed his sister's cheeks. "Away with ye, Miss Troublemaker," he said, smiling at Clara. "We best be going, or we'll be late and in even more trouble." With his arm linked in Clara's, he walked her back to school. Clara kept her head down and avoided the teacher's eye. Jimmy sat straight-backed, hanging on Mrs. McKinnon's every word. "Teacher's pet," Clara muttered, then regretted her unkind thoughts. It was hard to resent Jimmy. His dirty clothes disguising his too thin frame, the tangled mess of unbrushed curls perched on his head. She tried to emulate her friend, sitting still on the wooden seat, repeating her times tables, listening to the teacher. But the pull of the outdoors on her free spirit was strong, the view so tempting. By 5 o'clock, the effort of conforming had exhausted her. Chapter 5. May 1905. As Jimmy neared school, a spring entered his step. The first Watson bairn allowed an education. He didn't intend to waste the opportunity. Rose had announced on his 7th birthday that he would start school the next day. As he grew older, he realised it had been a calculated move on her part. As their only son, he would follow his dad into fishing. But Alex Watson was unreliable. Drunk by the time he sold his catch, he often fetched a poorer price than if he had his wits about him. Rose was no fool. She needed someone to take over the finances, and for that, her son would need educating. Jimmy always arrived early and found his teacher appreciated not just his promptness, but his attitude towards his studies. Mrs. McKinnon was different with him. She looked into his eyes, willing him to absorb the knowledge she had to share. His teacher was aware, even if Jimmy wasn't, that he was a bright boy. "Sponge Jimmy," she called him, on account of the fact he sucked up all the knowledge she could throw at him. Within weeks of starting school, she gave him his own work, leaving the other island children flailing behind. This school day followed the pattern of every other. The time flew by, the end-of-day bell both a surprise and an unwelcome reminder of the reality lurking beyond the schoolroom walls. As Jimmy was leaving for the day, Mrs. McKinnon stopped him. She placed a chilly hand on his arm and waited for the children to file out. When just the two of them remained, she looked at him. "Jimmy, would you like to stay behind for extra classes at the end of each day?" "Aye, miss, that I would, but Mam will never allow it. She wants me home to help with the bairns." "Let me see what I can do," said Mrs. McKinnon. She winked and Jimmy flushed at the uncharacteristic behaviour of his stern teacher. That evening, Jimmy and Rose sat mending nets when a knock came on their door. "Get that, Jim." Mrs. McKinnon stood in the doorway, her firm manner and steely eyes an equal match for Rose. "Hello, Jimmy. Is your mam home?" Rose pushed past him in the doorway. "What do ye want?" Her rudeness left Jimmy mortified. "I have a proposition for you," said Mrs. McKinnon. "I need some help in the schoolroom. Could I borrow Jimmy for an hour at the end of each day, to help clean the place up, stack chairs and such like?" "No ta," said Rose, moving to close the door on the teacher. Mrs. McKinnon stuck her booted foot in the doorway and poked her head into the gap. "I'll pay him £1 a week." "A shilling?" said Rose. "Aye, all right." With that, she closed the door once more. Mrs. McKinnon knocked again. "What?" shouted Rose, loping back across the room. "Can you not see we've work to do?" "I wanted to say how well Jimmy is doing with his studies." "Grand," said Rose, and turned away. Jimmy gave his teacher a shy smile and closed the door. He turned to see Rose gazing at him. "Don't be getting any fancy ideas from Miss High and Mighty. Your place is here. Once you can take care of the money, I want you on the boat with your da, reet?" Jimmy nodded, his shoulders slumping down. The following afternoon, as the school day drew to a close, Jimmy felt his palms grow sweaty and his heart begin a frantic thump in his chest. His classmates rushed out like freed prisoners, but Jimmy walked to the front of the room and cleared his throat. "What job would you like me to start with?" Mrs. McKinnon laughed. It was an alien sound coming from the fierce schoolmistress. "No chores, Jimmy." She smiled at him and signalled for him to sit down. "Have you heard of Rabbi Burns?" He shook his head as she pulled a dogged book of poetry from her desk drawer. Chapter 6. May 1906. Thanks to the £1 a week, Jimmy enjoyed a year of extra studies. Rose made him hand over his coin on a Friday and kept them hidden in a tin behind the privy, safe against Alex's wish to drink their money away. One Friday, Jimmy returned to the cottage and handed over his £1 as usual. "That'll be the last one," said Rose as she made her way outside. Jimmy followed her. "What do you mean, ma'am?" "Ha! You're the clever clogs. Work it out," she said, brushing past her son. "I thought ye were happy for me to be learning." "Aye, reet I was, but you'll turn 11 tomorrow, and it's time you were out helping your da." Jimmy was powerless. "Can I go tomorrow and say thanks to Mrs. McKinnon?" "Ye'll be out on the boat tomorrow. Why thank her? Ye've been her skivvy for years, haven't ye?" Her eyes dared him to admit the unspoken truth between them. Jimmy turned on his heel and fled the cottage. Their school lay in darkness, but a yellow glow came from the rooms above. No pupil would dare venture into the teacher's living quarters. Mrs. McKinnon appeared, framed within the lighted window, reaching across to close her curtains. She glanced down, holding his gaze for a moment before shutting out the night. As he walked away, Jimmy heard his name being called. "Jimmy! Jimmy!" Mrs. McKinnon stood outside the schoolroom, but she didn't look her fierce self. She was wrapped in a blanket, and her hair, rather than pinned in a bun, hung below her waist. She beckoned to him, and he walked towards her. Sharp eyes darted over him, taking in his flushed face. "You'd better come in." He followed her to a side door and up the flight of wooden stairs to her living quarters. Several oil lamps bathed the small room in light. Against the far wall stood piles of books reaching the ceiling. On another wall hung photographs and paintings of landscapes dominated by lakes and mountains. "Sit," she said, and Jimmy sat himself on a wooden chair, adorned with coloured cushions. A small bed stood in the corner, covered in silks and cottons. The room took Jimmy aback. It was so incongruous with the stern teacher that for a while he couldn't speak. Mrs. McKinnon seemed not to mind, making tea without asking why he had come. Settling a steaming cup on a polished table, she pulled up a chair and looked at Jimmy with questioning eyes. I won't be at school tomorrow, or any other day, so I wanted to say ta." "Well," she said, "they gave you longer than I expected. This moment was inevitable." "I don't want to leave," said Jimmy, hands shaking as he picked up his cup. "I know, but we don't choose the life we're born into. We have to do our best with the lot we're dealt." Jimmy nodded, and for a few moments they sat in silence, sadness hanging in the air, sucking the brightness from the room. "Keep hold of your dreams, Jimmy. You're a clever lad. Who knows where your path might lead? I never thought I'd be a school mistress on an island. Look at me now." She gave a smile that didn't reach her eyes before moving across to the piled books. Jimmy watched as she thumbed through the various titles. After squinting at the books for a while, she pulled out a volume with one hand, steadying the others on top so they didn't fall. Mrs. McKinnon handed him the book she had chosen, The Complete Poems and Songs of Robert Burns. Jimmy took it from her and stroked the worn book with his thumbs. "Someone special gave that to me. Now I want you to have it." She pushed his hands away as he tried to return the book, embarrassed by her generosity. "Ta," he said. He opened the cover and noticed a handwritten message. "To my dearest Maggie, my very own red rose. All my love, Christopher." Jimmy's cheeks reddened, and he closed the book, abashed at this private world he had stumbled upon. "It's all right, Jimmy," said Mrs. McKinnon, noticing his embarrassment and smoothing over it. "Christopher was my fiancé. We were to marry when he returned from the Boer War, but he never came back. Now you know why I've become the spinster schoolma'am that I am. Please don't tell your friends. I'm not ashamed of my position in life, but I don't wish to be the subject of village gossip." "I won't tell a soul." Mrs. McKinnon stood up, signalling it was time to say goodbye. She reached across and took his hand in hers. "Good luck, Jimmy. I hope life deals you a kind hand." As she was turning away, she said, "I've more books if you'd like them, but you'd need somewhere safe to keep them." Jimmy stepped out into the dusk. The moon was 3/4 full. The island bathed in a silvery glow. Not yet ready to return home, he passed the Presbyterian church, the parish church, and found himself by the ruined priory. Lit by moonlight, stone pillars and arches took on an ethereal quality. He could see the ancient monks walking through its grand halls and cloisters, hear the rustle of coarse robes and plaintive songs sung. He strolled on and paused at a little sandy beach. Mrs. McKinnon had told him of Cuthbert, and he wondered if he now stood in the footsteps of the saint. He thought of Cuthbert, wading out till neck-deep in water, and shivered. Saint or not, standing in freezing water each night sounded like madness. Jimmy stuck to dry land, leaving the beach and climbing up a grassy embankment. Halfway up, he veered off, taking a path invisible unless standing on the beach, his feet picking their way as the cliff descended inches to his left. He leaned into the rock, walking on until he reached a booth, cut into the cliff face. Nestled between the pebbled beach and cliff top, it hid him away from prying eyes. The remains of a fire sat in the centre of the cave. No doubt someone had been here wooing a lassie, he thought, and kicked the ashes to check they weren't fresh. Against a smooth rock, Jimmy took out the book of poems and read. Chapter 7. March 1907. Despite the winter fishing season nearing its end, there was plenty of work to do. Anna left soon after daybreak to fetch water from the well and sent Clara to collect mussels for baiting. Clara walked to the shoreline. She knew by heart the best places to find them and picked her way over loose rocks left exposed by the outgoing tide. With no breeze, the rock pool lay still, acting as a mirror to the sky. Her bucket splintered its glassy surface, disturbing the life hidden on its sandy floor. Clara began removing mussels from their rocky home with an expert twist and flick of her wrist. Other women and girls were doing the same. The older women had creels on their backs and moved with a pace that Clara envied. Clara walked to the Watson girls, working alongside them in companionable silence. When she straightened her aching back, she saw Rose stomping towards them. "Get out of there! That's our pickings!" "Oh, sorry," said Clara. "I wasn't trying to take what's yours. Here, take some of mine." She began transferring some of her haul into little Marnie's basket. "Do ye think we need your charity?" said Rose, grabbing a handful of mussels from Marnie and scattering them over rocks with force. Clara looked at her, open-mouthed, but Rose stared until Clara moved away. She glanced over at the family. Marnie looked up, caught her eye and smiled. She waved to Clara. Clara waved back. Rose noticed, and Marnie got a smack that Clara felt the sting of from many feet away. Clara returned home and sat with Anna, threading the mussels onto a line. She watched her mam, carefully trying to replicate her effortless movements, but try as she might, she couldn't match her pace. As they worked, Clara told her about the incident on the beach. "How can someone be so unkind to their bairns?" "Unkind people are unhappy people," said Anna. As her mam reached over and squeezed her hand, Clara was aware how lucky she was. Two small girls walked through the door of the cottage, followed by Jimmy. Their clothes were as grubby as their smiles were wide. "Can Clara come play?" The youngest girl looked at Anna through a mass of untamed curls. "Please, ma'am, I'll take the bairns to search for fossils. I can help you with the bait once I'm home." Anna smiled, put down the line she was working on, and knelt beside the two girls. "And who might you be?" The younger of the two stuck a thumb in her mouth and hid behind her brother. "This wee one is Marnie, and this here is Ada," said Jimmy, trying to move Marnie from her hiding place. "Marnie the monster," he said into the small girl's curls. She giggled, peeking out from beneath her mass of blonde hair and smiling at Anna. "Ah, that's right. I've seen you girls around the village, but I get confused with the names. There are so many of you. Pleased to meet you, Ada." The girl shook Anna's outstretched hand. Turning to Marnie, she tried again. "Pleased to meet you, Marnie." Marnie looked at her brother for reassurance. After getting his nod of approval, she removed the thumb from her mouth, wiped it on her dress, and offered an outstretched hand. "I'm surprised to see you, Jimmy. Are you not out fishing today?" "No, Miss Anna. My dad's poorly in bed." Jimmy flushed deep red as he spoke. "Mam asked me to get the bairns out of the house so he can have some peace." Anna nodded. "You'd best be off then. Bring me back a fossil and mind you're home in time for supper." She shooed the children out of the cottage. The young girls took Clara's hands and Jimmy followed behind. Clara called over her shoulder. "What's up with your da? Is he all right?" Jimmy muttered a reply, but Marnie, shyness gone, was happy to give Clara information. "Mam said it's his own fault for getting paralytic last night. He was heaving in the night. Now he has a sore head." Clara didn't know Alex well, but she'd seen him staggering through the village and heard him yelling in the street when she was trying to sleep. She thought of Bill and once again recognised her own good fortune. They walked through the village until they reached a cluster of small tin sheds. Creels spilled across the ground, and a curtain of nets hung from poles. Old John Dunton perched on a box, pipe between his teeth, net between his legs. "Back in a tick," said Jimmy, running to chat with the old man. The girls waited impatiently for their brother, Marnie jumping onto a wall and yelling, "Quit your blethering!" Old John waved to her as Jimmy obeyed and joined his sisters. Clara and Jimmy lifted the girls over a crumbling stone wall before climbing it themselves and following the edge of a farmer's field. Crops turned to grassy scrubland as the field sloped down to a pebble beach. "Let's have a competition. Whoever finds the most coffee beads is the winner." The two girls yelped with enthusiasm, searching among the stones for the small fossils. "Look, Clara, look!" said Marnie, holding out her palm. The grey fossil was as large as a shilling, the biggest Clara had seen. Neat lines rimmed its circular edge, as though someone had pressed a fork into dough. The lines smoothed out towards a round hole, gaping at its centre. Clara ruffled Marnie's hair. "It'll be hard to beat that." They continued their search, and within half an hour the pockets of Clara's skirt were bulging with small fossils. As Clara bent to pick up a sixpence-sized fossil, something hard hit her head. She turned, and another object hit her on the forehead. Jimmy reached down to grab a handful of shells from his basket. "Jimmy Watson, you stop doing that or I'll—" "You'll what?" said Jimmy, pelting Clara with shells once more. Clara bunched up her long skirt and ran, drawing fossils from her pockets and hurling them towards him. The girls joined in, and the four children ran screeching round the beach, shells and fossils flying like missiles through the clear air. Clara grabbed another bead to throw, but her boot caught on a rock and she fell backwards into the icy March water. The cold acted as watery pins, piercing through layers of wool and stinging her skin. Splayed out on her back in a stunned silence, she could make out the shape of Jimmy blocking the sun. "Hey, are you all right?" His face was full of concern, but seeing his solemn expression, Clara laughed, and soon was laughing so hard she couldn't get herself back up. Marnie and Ada joined the laughter, jumping in the tiny waves that lapped the shore, flinging fossils high into the air, peppering ripples over the otherwise smooth surface of the water. Jimmy reached a hand to Clara and heaved her up. Her front was dry, but her back was sopping wet, and she shivered with the bite of the cool March air. "Here," said Jimmy, removing his gansey and placing it around her shoulders. They sat on the beach, watching the girls running in and out of the waves. "Jimmy, can I ask you something?" "Aye?" "How often is your poorly?" Jimmy stared at the ground. Clara wondered if he'd answer, but he lifted his head and said, "Most days." The girls ran over, and the moment passed. "I'd best get back," said Clara, pointing to her sodden back. "Aye, you don't want to catch a cold." The girls protested, but Jimmy scooped one under each arm, and they made their way towards the village. Back at the cottage, Clara changed out of her wet clothes, hanging her dress to dry by the fire. She returned to her work and recounted what she'd heard about Alex Watson. Anna sighed. "Aye, well, I'm not surprised. Alex Watson should be careful. The sea's a dangerous place, but to be out there under the influence, well, that's madness." Chapter 8. April 1907. Jimmy leaned starboard and ran his palm across the hull of the Mary Lou. Sharp splinters scratched his skin. Peels of paint jammed beneath his nails. The pads of his fingers pressed down, sinking into a soft patch of rot. He sighed. There was never enough money to fix her up. The Mary Lou was a shadow of her former self. Men walked past, shaking their heads as they took in the peeling paint and bodged repairs. Jimmy kept his head down. Their footsteps receded, and he peered up through his curls. The Mary Lou's crew was sauntering towards him and he vaulted out of the boat to greet them. "Any sign of the skipper? I thought he might be with ye," said Jimmy. He scanned the shoreline, but saw no sign of Alex. The crew shook their heads. They leaned against the harbour wall, taking meagre pinches of baccy from rusty tins, rolling it tight, killing time. Jimmy wondered if they should begin preparing the boat, but until they knew whether Alex would appear, there was little point. "I've got better things to do than wait around all day," said Robert, self-appointed leader of their motley bunch. He sucked hard on his tab before jerking his head for the other men to follow. They looked from Robert to Jimmy. "We should wait a little longer," said Jimmy. "Nah, tide's heading out. If he's nae here by now, he's nae coming." Jimmy knew Robert was right, but resented the weasel of a man questioning his authority. It was hard to find a crew for a boat barely seaworthy, whose skipper was unreliable paying wages. Jimmy was unsure where Alex had recruited his men from, but he guessed some of them had never fished before. Robert's smugness and swagger were unfounded, for he showed little aptitude out on the water. "Get on with ye then," said Jimmy. One lost day would not matter much, for the Mary Lou never matched the haul of other boats. Although Jimmy worked hard, no amount of work could reverse the fortunes of his dad's enterprise. Knowledge passed down to Jimmy by his dad was scant. A less able lad would have missed the titbits flung out during sober episodes. Information crucial for navigating the waters and steering the boat away from hazardous rocks that lurked beneath its waves. Relief came when Alex passed out, and Jimmy could guide the men in their endeavours. Fishing was in his blood. With another crew on a different boat, he might have even enjoyed it. Further along the harbour, Bill was readying his boat, and Jimmy strolled over to watch. The Annabelle was a beauty. Flat-bottomed and high-bowed, painted in crisp blue, red and white. "You nae out today?" said Bill. "Nah, Dad's not shown up." "Want a trip on Annabelle?" "Aye," said Jimmy, grinning as he jumped down beside Bill. The crew shuffled to make room for Jimmy and picked up their oars. Beyond the harbour, they raised the lug's sail and were soon sprinting over curling waves. A vast sea spread before them. The world opened up, and Jimmy dreamed of sailing to new lands. From Bill, Jimmy filled in the blanks left by patchy knowledge handed down by his own dad. Bill would have Jimmy as a permanent member of his crew given the chance. Although young, Jimmy was tall and strong and kept pace with the best of them. Bill remembered Clara telling him Jimmy hated fishing. Watching him mucking in with the rest of the crew, Bill didn't believe it was fishing Jimmy hated. It was his fisherman dad. The following day, Alex graced them with his presence, and the Mary Lou creaked her way out of harbour. Jimmy looked across at the Annabelle, the crew nodding to him as he passed. Alex couldn't go out as far as the other boats, given the condition of his vessel, and Jimmy couldn't decide if he preferred the days they came home with a good haul or the days they didn't. After successful trips, the joy of a good catch would be short-lived. Coming from the Fisherman's Arms, whose landlord acted as banker, Alex would be drunk. Jimmy curled in embarrassment as he slurred out lies, cursing the stingy banker, the stench of ale on his breath exposing the true miser among them. Today would not be one of those days. Alex sat grim-faced and stony-eyed as the Mary Lou sailed home, nothing to show for their day at sea. He was the first to leave the boat when they moored up, striding along the harbour side, fists clenched. There was still work to do, but Jimmy recognised the signs and threw apologies at the crew as he ran to catch Alex. Jimmy kept a few paces behind, waiting to see the direction Alex would take, praying he would head to the pub and not the cottage. Alex stood in the middle of the street, feeling in his pockets. He pulled them inside out, but they were bare. Jimmy knew what was coming. He jumped in front of the cottage door. "How about we go for a walk, Da?" "Let me pass." "Come on, Da, you're upset. Let's leave the barrens a while and come back later." "Let me pass." "Da!" Alex put his shoulder to Jimmy's side and shoved him out of the way. He pushed past, standing in the middle of the room, glaring. Rose sat still at the table, holding her breath. The bairns ran and cowered in a corner. "I need coins." "We didna have no coins," said Rose. Alex took a step forward and bent down, nose to Rose's cheek. "I said I need coins. We didna have none." In one swift movement, Alex grabbed Rose's hair, slamming her head into the table. "Where are they?" Rose tried to speak, but he had squashed her head down so hard her lips couldn't move. Alex yanked her hair, whipping her head back before smashing it back down. Pinned to the table, Rose's eyes sought Jimmy's. Blood was pooling on the wood beside her. In 3 strides, Jimmy reached Alex, pulling him backwards. Alex kept hold of Rose's hair, and she let out a scream. "Let go of her," said Jimmy. "Let go." Alex laughed, released Rose from his grip, and turned to Jimmy. Experience taught Jimmy it was best not to fight back. If he did, the beating would last longer, and his sisters would be more frightened. Jimmy stood and waited for Alex to do his worst. The next few minutes blurred into a series of fists and feet. Slumped beside the table leg, Jimmy's fingers felt around his body. There was an egg on the back of his head. Sticky blood clung to his eyebrow. A stream of blood poured from his nose. He tried to stand, but pain ripped through his chest. Below his ganzi, he saw the first blue tint of bruises forming. Alex turned his attention to the cottage, turning over the mattress, chairs, blankets. Beneath the store of driftwood, he found a shilling. After holding it to Rose's face, he stormed from the cottage, slamming the door behind him. However hard he hit her, however much damage he caused, Rose never once mentioned the tin of shillings in the privy, and Jimmy admired her for it. He wondered what she would be like had she married a man like Bill. She worked as hard as any woman on the island, but did it with bruises and broken bones, knowing her hard-earned money would go into the pocket of a pub landlord. She fed her children on scraps, rejected fish from her husband's catch, potatoes and the odd loaf of bread. Her size was thanks to nature, not nurture, for Jimmy often noticed her skipping meals so her children ate. She was harsh, brash and often unkind, but Jimmy was astute enough to realise she loved her bairns. Chapter 9. April 1907. On Easter Day, Clara woke to the soft thud of a mug being placed beside her on the dresser, and the weather-beaten face of Bill smiling down at her. Steam danced in the air, and her own breath mixed with it as she reached to pick up the cup. Back against her pillow, she shivered as the cold of the room hit and slunk further down under the coarse woolen blanket. "What time is it, Da?" "5, he said. "We need to get gannin' if we're to make sunrise." Clara slipped from the warmth of her bed and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, following the sounds coming from the small kitchen. The hearth had been lit, and Clara hung the blanket on the back of her chair as she sat down. "Happy Easter, ma'am." "Happy Easter, love." Anna placed down 2 boiled eggs in front of her daughter. She cleared the broken nets and fishing hooks Bill had been tinkering with, and in their place put a jug of wild flowers. "Eat up, Clara. The sun will come up soon." Once they finished their eggs, the small family pulled on their warmest garments and headed off down the dark village streets. Just visible was a small light on the Heugh, the highest point on the island. They climbed towards it, joining other local families gathering for the ritual of seeing in the Easter dawn. Someone propped a large wooden cross against a stone shelter, and they waited with anticipation for the sun to ascend. They had witnessed countless sunrises, but none compared with the Easter dawn. The weather blessed them with a clear sky, and it wasn't long before a vast array of pastel pinks replaced the solid darkness. As the first sliver of sun slid above the distant castle, a band of orange burnt above the sea-like flames. Their collective voices welcomed its coming with a hearty rendition of "Christ the Lord is risen today." The sun continued its ascent, throwing shards of light onto the ripples of the harbour. Many would have thought their life hard, all their time devoted to the rhythms and tasks of fishing life for little reward. But standing on that hill, island life felt magical. The family took their time greeting neighbours. Bill shook the hands of his fellow fishermen, even nodding to Alex Watson. Anna huddled with the women folk, sharing any gossip from the few hours since they last spoke. Clara smiled as she watched them. No stranger could pick Anna out as an interloper. She looked as at home among the fishing community as any other woman there. The disquiet caused when Bill had announced Anna as his bride was long forgotten. There had been an expectation he would marry his own kind, and many questioned whether his young lass would keep up with the work of a fisherman's wife. Within a few short months, Anna had not only proved the islanders wrong, but had captured the hearts of men and women alike. Island men respected the way she carried out her duties, and envied her husband for finding someone with such beauty. The women of the island warmed to her amiable smile and conversation. A year after they married, the islanders thought her one of their own. Anna left her friends and stood beside Clara, wrapping an arm across her shoulder as they stared out at the sea. "This is the most beautiful place on earth. I thought so the first day I set foot on this island, and nothing's happened in the intervening years to change my mind." "Tell me again how you came to marry Da." Anna laughed. "Again? Really?" Clara grinned and gave an enthusiastic nod of her head. "Well, I was living down in North Shields with my parents when I met your Da. He was in town dealing with some fishing business. The first time I saw him was when my mother sent me out to run some errands for her. I was carrying a basket full of bits and pieces, walking through Fish Quay, minding my business, when the heel of my boot caught the hem of my skirt. Everything from my basket spilled over the path, and a man bent down to put the items back. The most handsome man I ever saw. He made sure I got home, and I had butterflies in my stomach long after he'd left. After that, every time he came to North Shields, he would call on me. Before long, we were stepping out. My father was not best pleased about it, I can tell you. He shouted and cursed when I told him we were to be married, and none of my family came to the wedding. I've not seen any of them since I left that house, and I don't regret it for a moment. It was the best decision I ever made." A smile played on her lips as she spoke, a mischievous glint in her eye. "It's so romantic," said Clara with a sigh. "Aye, it is, but you've got plenty of years before you need to think about romance. Now, why don't you join that rabble?" Anna pointed to the beach where the Watson children were playing. Clara ran down to the harbour and joined Jimmy and his sisters. Soon they were skimming stones, squealing with delight as they skipped along the surface of the calm water. It was a rare opportunity to play by the harbour side, for they knew the upset it would cause if they were here while the fishermen were working. Bill told Clara many times of the occasion when, innocent of their ways, his new bride brought him supper before he ventured out to sea. Her appearance at the water's edge caused terror among his crew. They abandoned fishing for the day, convinced some terrible fate would befall them. He laughed as he told the tale, but Clara was careful to keep her distance when she knew the men were working. As the islanders began to disperse and climb down from the heugh, Clara left her playmates and ran over to her parents. She took her dad's hand, the familiar roughness of his skin worn hard from hauling ropes and lines. "Clara, why don't you have a quick tidy of the lobster pots? There's something there you'll like," said Anna. Clara rushed to the strewn debris by their front door. Amidst the lines, nets, pots and mussel shells lay a small package wrapped in newspaper and tied with string. "Is this for me?" she asked. "Yes, love. Bring it inside and you can open it." Clara rushed inside and put the package down on the table. Fighting back her impatience, she pulled back the paper, taking care not to damage whatever was inside. A small toy rabbit sat amongst the paper. Clara picked it up and turned it around in her hands. It was beautiful, made from patchwork fabric and sewn delicately with invisible seams. "I thought it would be nice to have a sign of spring," said Anna.
Did you make it? Clara asked.
Aye. Clara hugged her. She knew how hard Anna worked, how little free time she had. You're the best mam in the world, said Clara, hugging Anna again. Chapter 10. May 1910. A thick mist hung over the island for the entire month of May, clinging to the rocks along the shoreline and cloaking the village in murky half-light. On the eve of her 15th birthday, Clara rubbed at the small window of the cottage, as if by clearing the inside of the glass she would banish the ghostly fingers that swirled beyond it. To walk out in clear air, gulls above and seals basking on rocks would be the best birthday gift. It didn't look promising. Staring at it won't make it go away, called Anna. Clara sighed and joined her parents at the old wooden table. Bill chuckled upon seeing her deep frown and covered her small hand with his. Tomorrow will be a fine day, even without fine weather, he said. Clara looked up at him and smiled into his big, kind eyes, creased in amusement at her frustration. She jumped at a loud banging on the door. There's a ship in trouble, yelled the voice from outside as the sound of heavy boots thundered past the cottage. Bill stood, and his chair fell with a crash against the stone floor. Without stopping to pick it up, he grabbed his sou'wester from its hook, pulled on his boots, gave his wife and child a kiss, then ran out of the door. Jimmy sat fighting with a tangled piece of line when a hammering came on the cottage door. Alex, said a gruff voice. Alex! The man's voice was urgent. Jimmy rushed across to open the door. Old John stood outside in his wet weather gear, face flushed and an anxious look in his eyes. Where's your dad, lad? We need to launch the lifeboat. Jimmy glanced over his shoulder in embarrassment. Old John looked through the gloom to the pathetic figure of Alex by the fire. Slumped backwards, his arms hung by his sides, head tilted back, cheeks puce. Old John swore and kicked a lobster pot in anger, causing Alex to stir, before resuming both his position and his snoring. I guess ye must eat then, lad. Grab your gear. Jimmy hesitated only briefly, for he knew there would be no waking Alex, and besides, Jimmy wouldn't dare say no to old John Dunton. He grabbed his sou'wester, boots, and followed the burly old man through the village. They met Bill coming out of his cottage, and Jimmy listened as the two men discussed the situation. It's a steamer, likely run aground. They saw the rockets at Longstone, but Seahouse's lifeboat is in for repairs, so we got the shout. The beach teemed with island men. Old John led Jimmy to the lifeboat house. Trepidation mingled with awe as Jimmy stared at the 34-foot vessel, her low middle sweeping to high air cases at either end. He got straight to work, attaching horses to the trailer that would launch the lifeboat into swirling mist-strewn waters. She was a heavy beast, and it took 6 horses to help her slip into the water. Jimmy climbed aboard and took up his oar. As he gripped the wood, his knuckles clenched white, aware that as the smallest of the crew, he would need to hold his own. It seemed as if the entire island were holding its breath, then exhaling in a plume of misty smoke that hung just above the waterline. The crowd on the shore was silent, but for quiet prayers muttered under their breath. Grace Darling slipped her way into the water, and the men began their perilous journey into the dense fog. Jimmy had been out in rough seas, where waves rose like ancient monsters, threatening to consume you beneath their aching jaws. Tonight, he was more frightened than he ever had been at sea. There was an eerie stillness. The sea was flat and calm, but the surrounding air nightmarish. Tendrils of fog swirled around the boat in a slow, ghostly dance. The silence chilled him. He was used to sea that played out a rowdy song of crashing waves and screaming gulls. Now, all he heard was the plopping of oars cutting through the black water beneath, and the patter of droplets as the oars rotated through the air. The coxswain signalled to put down their oars. The men pulled them up and caught their breath. The lifeboat was heavy, and Jimmy cursed the sting of blisters on the pads of his fingers. A sticky trickle of sweat ran down the back of his shirt.
"What's doing, John?" asked one of the crew. "Ah, damn it, I canna see a thing out there," said their coxswain, scanning the horizon to no avail.
The men looked around them. A shudder of fear flowed through the boat. The usual landmarks that guided their way had vanished. Hayflaw, swingle trees, Beal Muck Midden, the beanstacks, all had melted away beneath the blanket of fog. The men sat in silence, twisting themselves round to glimpse anything that might give them a clue where they were. Nothing. The boat sat bobbing on the oily, ebony surface of the water, the cloying dense fog showing no sign of abating. They knew these waters like the backs of their hands. Knowledge passed through generations like a treasured heirloom. This damn fog had rendered all that prized knowledge worthless. Jimmy's body prickled with panic. He was taking many breaths, but getting no air into his lungs. His head spun, his palms were sweaty. Jimmy pressed his hand to his chest to still his heart, but it beat rapidly, banging against its bony cage. He spun his head round, trying to spot signs of hope in the other men's faces, but the frowning foreheads, wide eyes and silent mouths betrayed their fear. Jimmy's small body shook. He wrapped his arms around himself to control it, but to no avail. A large hand came down with some force on his shoulder and squeezed it. Bill leant in close and began speaking into Jimmy's ear.
"Deep breaths, Jim lad. Deep breaths. You'll be reet. We will get out of here. Dinna ye fret."
The pounding in his chest let up. His breathing became slower, and the prickling around his body ceased.
"Ta,"
he said over his shoulder.
"Nae bother,"
said Bill, giving Jimmy's shoulder one last squeeze before resuming his position in the boat.
"Lads," called the coxswain, and 12 heads spun around. "We canna sit here all night. I say we press on. We're heading northeast, but easy does it. We will na see the rocks in this bloody fog, and we dinna want the rescuers to end up needing rescue."
On his command, the men gripped their oars and continued to row, parting the curtain of grey that closed behind them as the boat inched its way through. A shout pierced the ghostly silence. "Ahoy there! Over here!" The crew paused their rowing, listening out for the voice. Old John barked orders, and with some effort, they swung the vessel round and followed the sound of the call. Out of the gloom appeared the silhouette of a ship. As the lifeboat edged towards it, the crew knew something was amiss. Its hull was at a strange angle, the starboard side jutting out too high. It reminded Jimmy of when he'd fallen from a tree and broken his arm, leaving the bone straining at the skin. The lifeboat pulled up alongside the ship. As they drew closer, Jimmy rubbed his eyes, convinced he must be hallucinating. Other men exclaimed at the sight, and Jimmy knew the image was real. Over the side of the ship leaned a young boy with a fishing line. Jimmy's mouth gaped open. It reminded him of the Tweed, where children gathered with crabbing pots and fishing lines, but this was no summer's day. On seeing the lifeboat approach, the boy raised an arm and waved at the crew on board. "Ahoy there! Have you come to rescue us?"
"Aye, that we have, lad,"
old John called back, tugging at his beard in bewilderment.
"Where's the rest of your crew?"
"Oh, they're down below trying to patch the hole. We got lost in the fog and found ourselves caught on these here rocks."
"So I see. Will you fetch the captain for me?"
"Yes, sir, that I can. He's my father." The boy propped his fishing rod against the side of the ship and disappeared, returning a few moments later with the captain.
"Good evening, gentlemen. I see you've met my son."
Old John shouted instructions to the captain, and soon the crew of the distressed steamer assembled on the deck, ready to make their way into the lifeboat. It was a slow process getting the men across, but at least the sea lay docile beneath them. The captain's son came across first and settled himself next to Jimmy. The boy chatted away, oblivious to the danger he had been in, and thrilled at the rescue. Jimmy warmed to the boy, drawing comfort from his laissez-faire attitude. His clenched muscles loosened, as the boy whittled on. Once the last of the crew reached the safety of the lifeboat, old John issued the order to pull away, and the Grey Starling slipped back through the water to the relative safety of the open sea. The men briefly paused their rowing as the steamer let out a groan before keeling over, the sea eating it up into its depths. Relief was temporary, for the next challenge was to navigate to sea houses further down the coast. Once again, they slipped through the fog, but they were in safer waters, the dangerous rocks that were the downfall of so many ships now behind them. They reached sea houses at first light. A night on the water had exhausted the men. Jimmy's oar had turned a reddish brown as the blisters on his hands burst, leaving a stain upon the wood. The village greeted them with a hero's welcome. The King's Arms opened its doors, and the men gathered by the fire, blankets around them, sipping sweet tea.
"Got anything stronger?"
called out old John, raising his cup as a signal to the landlord.
"Bit early, isn't it?" "Not if you haven't been to bed," said old John to guffaws from the crew.
Soon, the men each had a pint of ale in their hands, jovial despite their tiredness. The rescue had been a success, all lives spared. The captain's son lay sleeping across 3 stools and only woke as jugs of ale slammed down on tables as men laughed and bantered with each other. Bill clinked a knife against his jug, and the men paused in their merriment.
"Lads, I've just recalled that today is my daughter's birthday, which means it's also Jimmy's."
The crew cheered, clinking glasses with Jimmy and causing him to blush with pleasure.
"A fine way to begin your special day,"
said old John, and everyone cheered. A cart arrived to take the crew home, and they piled into the back, ready to begin the slow trudge up the coastline, back to the island. The men were soon dozing, lulled to their slumbers by the rocking of the cart and the rhythmic clacking of the horses' hooves. Chapter 11. May 1910. As dawn broke, Bill was yet to return. From Anna's uneven breathing, Clara knew she was awake. She tiptoed round the curtain and sat down on top of Anna's blankets. "Can we go to the harbour?" "Aye, all right, but I'll put the kettle on first." Clara was impatient to scan the horizon for signs of the lifeboat and its precious cargo, but seeing her mam's red-rimmed eyes, dark purple half-moons beneath them, she complied and went to fill the kettle herself. Anna was pulling on her underskirts as Clara appeared with a cup of steaming tea. She gave a weak smile, took the offered cup, and wished Clara a happy birthday. In all the worry, Clara had forgotten that today she turned 15. Despite herself, she rushed to the window. The fog had cleared. One birthday wish granted. If only Bill would walk through that door. By the time the women had dressed, there was still no sign of the lifeboat crew. They walked through glorious spring sunshine to the harbour, where they met several women from other families. None had news, but no news was good news, and all clung to that hope. The women shielded their eyes from the bright sunlight as they stared towards the horizon. Other than the few small fishing boats bobbing gently on the early morning tide, there was nothing but a calm, flat expanse of blue, stretching out for miles, broken only by the dark mass of the Farne Islands in the distance. Clara and Anna turned themselves away from the harbour and back towards their cottage. They walked in silence, neither wanting to burden the other with the dark thoughts filling their minds. A familiar figure sat at the kitchen table. "Da!" said Clara, running to Bill and flinging her arms round his giant frame. Anna followed suit, and only released him when he began laughing and spluttering.
"I'm all reet, or I will be as long as you let me git some air,"
he chuckled, wrapping an arm round Clara's waist and pulling Anna onto his lap. The relief that flooded the cottage was palpable. Clara and Anna settled themselves at the table as Bill sipped from a jug of ale thrust into his hand by a publican on his return. They listened as he recounted his story of the struggle through the fog. Clara's eyes widened as he told how they had found a small boy leaning over the side fishing, while the men below worked in a frenzied panic.
"We reached them just in time. 5 minutes after we'd got them all on the lifeboat, their own ship keeled over. If they'd still been on board, we'd have lost them to the sea."
"What about the lad?" Clara asked. Bill gave a deep guffaw and took another swig of his beer.
"Oh, he was reet enough. He reckoned it was the most exciting voyage his da had ever taken him on. I'll eat my hat if the boy's story didn't appear in the Advertiser this week."
His head already fuzzy from the ale and sea houses, Jimmy refused the offer of another on his return and left the other men behind to their revelry. The island was looking beautiful in the spring sunshine. As Jimmy walked along the grassy track, he stopped and bent to gather wildflowers. Satisfied with the blaze of colour that filled his palm, Jimmy carried the posy down to his shed by the harbour. Among the disorganised shelves, he found a roll of twine and secured the stems together. As he walked through the village, Jimmy paused at Clara's door, unsure whether to knock or leave the flowers for her to find. He told himself he didn't want to disturb the reunion taking place inside, but truth be told, he felt shy, his heart hammering inside his chest. He settled on a middle ground, placing a quiet knock on the door, hoping they wouldn't hear. Clara looked up from her sewing as she heard a gentle knocking on the door. She found Jimmy bending down, leaving a neat little posy on the doorstep.
"Jimmy, what are you doing?"
Jimmy straightened up, colour flushing his cheeks. He held the flowers out in front of him.
"Happy birthday," he said,
going redder still.
"Thank you,"
said Clara, her face turning a similar shade to his.
"Happy birthday to you too."
A voice called out from inside the cottage.
"Is that you, Jimmy? Come on in."
Clara stepped aside and Jimmy walked past her, head down, neither of them wanting to catch the other's eye. Bill slapped Jimmy hard on the back.
"This lad's a hero,"
he told his wife and daughter. By now Jimmy was sweating, desperate to escape into the air outside.
"I'm no hero. I did no more than the rest of ye." "You did, lad. Had to listen to that wee boy blethering away for hours. If it were me, I'd have shoved him overboard."
He let out a loud guffaw that splintered the tension and left Jimmy more at ease.
"Aye, it was a chatterbox, that one. Didn't seem afraid of being on a sinking ship, just wanted to catch his fish."
Jimmy started laughing. He laughed and laughed till his sides hurt. Clara watched Jimmy, and Anna watched Clara. She had seen them in the doorway and smiled to herself. Oh, to be young again. Bill poured some of his ale into a cup for Jimmy, and this time Jimmy didn't refuse. He sat with the family for a while before deciding he must return home. He thanked Anna for her hospitality and nodded at Clara, who blushed again. When he walked through the door of his cottage, Jimmy was almost knocked off his feet by the gaggle of girls who flung themselves at him. Several of his sisters had red-rimmed eyes, and it startled Jimmy that Rose's were the same.
"Glad you're back, lad."
As Rose moved past him, she squeezed his arm. Alex didn't get up from his seat, his mouth set in a hard line of resentment.
"Get off the lad," he said. "He's back from sea. Near war."
Jimmy's sisters took no notice, and Marnie gripped his hand all day. Chapter 12. June 1910. The days were drawing out, and the air turning warmer. So far, June had been unusually warm, and as Clara lay in bed, the mix of heat and anticipation made it impossible to sleep. With the herring season only a few weeks away, the island was abuzz with excitement. Everyone had more spring in their step, and island life teemed with colour and drama. Soon the population would swell, not just with crew, but also with herring girls. Bill's snoring was grating, making sleep more elusive. Layers of blankets lay strewn on the floor. Clara counted sheep, worked on her knitting, then gave up and climbed out of bed. She grabbed a shawl from the dresser and crept through the cottage. Her foot caught on a wooden stool, sending a loud scrape against the stone floor. She paused, listening for sounds of her parents stirring. Nothing. She clicked the iron door fastening up and stepped into the night air. Clara filled her lungs with a big gulp of sweet summer air and strolled through the village. Her legs guided her, following the paths they knew by heart. At the harbour, the air filled with sounds of small waves washing against fishing boats, then nicking the pebbles as they lapped against the shore. Stones crunched beneath her feet. Below the heugh, she hoisted up her skirt and climbed the rocky outcrop. Surrounded by inky darkness, she paused just a few seconds before moving on. It was cooler on the heugh, and Clara pulled her shawl closer to her as she walked. On the descent towards the priory, she hesitated, then turned to a thin path that hugged the rugged cliff. It was only wide enough for 1 foot at a time, and Clara questioned the sanity of walking it shrouded by darkness. A faint glow of light emanated from within the cave nearby. Unnerved, Clara considered heading back and retracing her steps, but there was no room to turn, and navigating the meagre path backwards was foolish in the dark. As she edged her way to the cave, relief flooded her when she poked her head around the jutting rocks and realised the lamp belonged to Jimmy. She watched him. He was reading by lamplight, his face shifting with emotion as his eyes moved down the page. An uninvited onlooker, she gave a quiet cough to make Jimmy aware of her presence. His head whipped up from the page he was reading. Her form unrecognisable against the night sky, Jimmy jumped backwards, kicking over the lamp and snuffing out the flame. "Who's there?" he called. "Jimmy, it's me, Clara." "Clara? What are you doing here?" Clara moved around the cold rock and flopped with relief in the small cave. Jimmy pulled a match from his pocket, struck it against the cave wall and held it to the lamp. "Couldn't sleep, so I went walking. What are you doing here?" Jimmy waved the book in front of him. "Here's the only place I can read. I'd be struck if they caught me at home." Clara nodded, then a thought occurred to her. "Jimmy, where did you get the book?" Jimmy looked at her. "Can you keep a secret?" Clara nodded, and he moved further back into the cave. She watched as he removed several large rocks that Clara had assumed were part of the cave wall. From beneath them, he pulled out a large cloth bag and handed it to Clara. Inside lay a pile of books. Clara gazed across at Jimmy. In answer to her unspoken question, he explained they were from Mrs. McKinnon, given on the condition he kept them somewhere safe. Clara knew that this meant away from Alex. Even if people found the secret caves, it would be dark enough for them not to notice the carefully placed rocks at its farthest recess. Clara reached into the bag and pulled out a copy of Oliver Twist. "Can I?" Jimmy nodded, picking up his own book and resuming where he had left off. Clara shifted to a more comfortable position, turning the book in her hands before settling down to read in companionable silence. She stole glances across at her friend, so unlike any other boys and men she knew. His blonde curls glowed in the lamplight, and thick lashes framed eyes the colour of the green flash at sunset. His book engrossed Jimmy, but Clara couldn't focus on the words on the page, reading the same sentence over and over. She dropped the book into her lap in frustration. "Jimmy?" He said, not looking up. "Why do you like these books?" "'Cause they take me to different places. Other lives," he murmured, turning the page and continuing to read. "But why would you want to? Our island's the best place on earth." Jimmy looked up. "Is that what you really think? There's an entire world out there, Clara. So much more than this." He gestured with his book to the beach, the sky, the island. "Nowhere's as beautiful as here." "How would you know? Have you ever left the island?" "You know I haven't, Jimmy Watson, but I can read too, and I listen to stories my mam tells of where she's from." "There's more places than just the island and North Shields," he laughed. Clara felt stung. "Well, if you hate it so much, you'd better go." Jimmy stood up, slamming his book shut and dropping it down to the floor. "Don't you think I would if I could? It's all right for ye. Perfect family, perfect life. You didn't understand what it's like for me. You're just a spoilt little girl."
The walls of the cave amplified his raised voice, and tears sprang to Clara's eyes. She wanted to run, but the dangerous path prevented her. Instead, she crept along the cliff, Jimmy's eyes burning into her with every step. Back on firm ground, Clara ran all the way home, angry with Jimmy, but also frustrated at herself for not understanding. She'd seen enough of his life to know it wasn't a bed of roses. Back at the cottage, Clara crept into bed, pulled a cushion over her face, and groaned. Chapter 13. June 1910. It was the end of June, and all the fishermen were out landing their creels. They piled them high on the harbour shore and outside their cottages. The excitement in the air was palpable, and at supper that night, Bill was both jovial and restless. He went to bed early, but lay tossing and turning, nervous energy keeping sleep at bay. When Clara woke the next morning, Bill had already left. After fetching water from the well, Clara wandered down to the harbour. Ahead of her were Jimmy and Alex. She hadn't seen or spoken to Jimmy since the night in the cave. Her cheeks flushed as she remembered that he'd called her a little girl. She did her best to dawdle, but Alex shuffled along, and it wasn't long before she had caught them up. "Morning," she said, flushing again as she strode past. She marched on, determined to put some distance between herself and the Watsons. To her dismay, she heard footsteps behind her as Jimmy caught her up. A large piece of rope hung from his shoulder, and the cap on his head couldn't quite contain his mass of golden curls. "Clara, I wanted to say sorry about our disagreement. I was unkind." "Well, you were, but I was also rude and insensitive. I understand there's more world out there than this island, Jimmy, but the island is all I need." She looked at him in the hope he understood. He caught her eye, but looked away. "If the island were a patchwork quilt, you'd be one square," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The area around the harbour was a hive of activity. All the fishermen were out, dragging nets from sheds and rolling barrels up above the ooze, ready for barking ropes, nets and sails. Despite the hard work that lay ahead, the harbour had a festive feel. Sullen fishermen were grinning and laughing with one another. Several greeted Clara and Jimmy as they passed. "What jobs are you doing today?" Clara asked as they neared the sheds. "Need to get the ropes barked. Want to come?" "Aye," said Clara, keen to be amidst the action. They entered the dusty wooden shed, and Jimmy bent down, fumbling around beneath a cluttered workbench and rifling through boxes. There was a small glass window facing the harbour, and Clara stepped over boxes and creels to look out. It was thick with grime, and she doodled the outline of birds into its filmy surface. "Hey, come give me a hand, will ye?" called Jimmy, his voice muffled by various debris. Clara bent down and grabbed the long length of rope Jimmy was holding out behind him. "I know there's more in here somewhere, but it's hard to see amongst all this junk." He sat back on his heels and stretched his arms out above him. "Didn't feel such a small space when I looked there last year." Clara laughed. His blonde curls were grey with dust and cobwebs. A small spider was crawling down his back. "Stay still," she said, and put her hands to his back. "I think you've disturbed this poor creature's slumber." Clara cupped her hands around its small body and showed it to Jimmy. He yelped and leaped back further into the shed. Clara looked at him in surprise, then burst out laughing. "Jimmy Watson, are you scared of spiders?" "Nah," he replied, a blush creeping from his neck to his cheeks. Clara folded her arms and stared at him. He squirmed and looked at his feet. "Well, aye, maybe a little." "You'd best come here then. You've probably got a fair few more in that mop on your head." She walked over to brush the cobwebs from his hair. Jimmy had to bend down for her to reach, and Clara ran her fingers through his curls, pulling out bits of sticky web. Despite the grit and tangled spider's silk, Jimmy's hair was soft, and curls twined round her fingers. A strange sensation crept through Clara's stomach, as if a kaleidoscope of butterflies were dancing around in there. Her hands paused their movement, and Jimmy looked up at her from beneath his hair. Clara pulled her hands away, causing Jimmy to cry out as a curl caught around her finger. "Careful, you'll pull it all out." Clara twisted away, for now it was her turn to blush, not at the pain she had caused him, but at the butterflies whose dance had intensified as she looked into his clear green eyes. She threw herself under the bench so he wouldn't notice her pink cheeks and called behind her, "Tell me what you need and I'll get it. It's easier for me. I'm not a lanky beanpole like ye." "Hey," he said, grateful to avoid both small space and spiders. Jimmy instructed her to look for the thick rope in need of barking. Clara slithered backwards and lifted a large piece of rope over her shoulder. "This is all you need?" "Aye, it will do for now. Dad can get the rest, if he can see straight." Jimmy opened the door for Clara, who stepped blinking into the bright summer sunshine. Her butterflies had ceased their frantic dance, but for occasional quivers of wings deep inside her. Oblivious, Jimmy spoke of the preparations ahead. The silver darlings would arrive any day now. At the Ouse, they threw down their ropes and watched steam bubble up from the large iron tanks. "Clara, what are ye doing here?" She turned and saw Bill carrying a large net, which was spilling over his muscular forearms. "I was helping Jimmy and wanted to come and watch." "All right, lass, but dinna stay long. Your mam needs you back at home. Here, come with me." Clara smiled at Jimmy as she followed Bill to one of the large vats, teeming with murky liquid. Nets and ropes lay along the grass, turning deep brown and left to dry in the warm sun. Jimmy spotted Alex amongst the group of fishermen and carried the ropes over to him. "Where's the nets?" "I got the ropes like you asked." "Stupid lad, I asked for nets and ropes." "No, you didn't," said Jimmy, holding his ground. Without warning, Alex lunged at him. Jimmy, taken by surprise, fell to the ground. Several pairs of hands, stained brown from the barking, reached down to help him up. Jimmy stared at Alex, then turned to fetch the nets. Clara looked on as Jimmy trudged back to the sheds, head hung low, shoulders slumped. She wanted to run after him and offer comfort, but knew she couldn't. That would be the last thing he wanted. It was an unspoken truth on the island that Alex Watson beat his family, but family business is private, and therefore no one thought to intervene. Instead, the islanders tried to help in other ways. Women left cast-off clothes at Rose's door. Mrs. Guthrie at the post office gave Sally a few shifts a week to make up their income. Jimmy closed the shed door, pulled out an old wooden chest and sat down. It was bad enough Alex treated his family like dirt behind closed doors, but to do it in front of the other men, that was a step too far. The fisherman witnessing the swiftness of Alex's fists left Jimmy mortified. He must return soon with the nets or face another public humiliation. He allowed a moment to collect himself, pull on the calm face that he displayed to everyone while boiling inside. Head in hands, he ran his fingers through his curls. He thought of Clara's delicate hands moving through his hair, and how happy he had been just a short while ago. Happiness, he thought, is fleeting. Chapter 14. June 1910. Clara didn't go straight back to the cottage after leaving the Ouse. Instead, she walked the long way through the village, keen to take in all the excitement. Nets hung from poles and hooks outside most of the small dwellings, and families moved in and out of their homes with a sense of urgent purpose. Every spare patch of grass on the outskirts of the village was strewn with nets and ropes, stretched out to dry from barking. Children ran squealing through the streets, caught in the flurry of activity around them. Fishermen wandered back to their homes for lunch, hands covered in a brown stain that spread to their elbows. Anna sat in the sun outside their cottage, a large net spread across her knees. "Clara, come help me. This needs barking tomorrow, and there are still some tears to mend." Pulling her wooden stool from inside, Clara positioned it close to Anna so they could share the net across their laps. Their hands worked skillfully, finding any tear or tangle, their delicate fingers mending with speed. Both looked up as Bill strode towards them. "Oh, Bill, look at you," Anna said, shaking her head at the sight of him. His hands and forearms had turned a deep brown, and his rolled shirt sleeves had not escaped the sticky liquid. There were splashes on his trousers and boots. Even his greying hair had turned rusty brown in places. "Wash yourself in the yard. I'm not having you in my cottage in that state." "Your cottage, is it?" he said, and reached down to kiss his wife. She batted him away, screeching and giggling as he threatened to caress her with his dirty hands. The sound of splashing water came from the yard. They stored the finished net carefully in a basket. Clara sat back in her chair and closed her eyes, the sun warming her lids. She opened them as Anna returned and sighed at the huge armful of nets she carried. Anna chuckled. "You didn't think we were done yet, did you?" She smoothed out a corner of the old net and they resumed their work. By the following morning, with most of the nets and ropes barked, the men had moved on to the sails. Clara snuck down to the ooze before Anna could find her more jobs. She loved to watch the men work, finding the camaraderie between them delightful. She perched herself on a stone wall and watched as men laid out sails on emerald green grass, the boiling tanks of bubbling brown liquid beside them. They grabbed buckets, ladles, anything they could lay their hands on, and filled them to the brim with thick, oozing goo. Liquid flew against the backdrop of a clear summer sky, covering the fabric of the sails with a satisfying thud. The men returned to the boiling tank, filled their containers, and threw another load over the sails. Thuds and splats filled the air as the sails turned a deep shade of brown. Jimmy appeared with a brush and began working the liquid into the fabric, rubbing hard against its seams. He moved fast, his face red with the effort, his shirt sleeves tightening over his muscles as he left no patch untouched. Clara jumped off the wall, not wanting to impede the men or their work. She would return the following day to watch the brown sails lying on the grass, turning a deep shade of red as they dried. Over the next few days, the barking continued until everything was dry and ready for tarring. What a fine sight they would be when they sailed off in search of silver. Chapter 15. June 1910. Jimmy returned from the day's barking, exhausted. It hadn't gone unnoticed by any man that Alex had slunk off earlier that afternoon. By the time Jimmy finished work for the day, Alex was already asleep in a drunken stupor, the younger bairns sleeping too. Soft light flickered as Rose sat mending nets by candlelight. "All right?" she asked him, glancing up from her work as Jimmy walked in. "Aye, not bad." Rose pushed a plate of food across the table. "Ta," he said. "You're a good lad, Jimmy," she said, eyeing the snoring figure of her husband before sighing and turning back to the net she was mending. Jimmy watched her working. He often wondered what had led her to this life. His grandparents had been long dead by the time he was born, and he knew nothing of her life growing up on the island. It couldn't have been easy, or she wouldn't have married a man like Alex Watson. As if reading his mind, Rose looked up at him. "He wasn't always like this, you know." She cocked her head towards the sleeping figure of her husband. "Aye, right," said Jimmy, embarrassed by his mam's candour. "Not when I married him, anyhow. He was handsome and clever. All the island girls wanted to marry Alex Watson. I was the lucky one he chose." She let out a laugh that held no mirth. Lucky. For the first time, Jimmy looked past the bitterness and discontent. He saw a hopeful young girl, wooed by a handsome fisherman, dreaming of a life so different from her own. Rose set down her net and muttered that it was time for bed. As she hauled her heavy body onto the wooden frame, Jimmy heard her whisper softly, "You're a good lad, Jimmy. A good lad." Jimmy woke at first light and headed for the beach. Several men had gathered, and the tar pots were already bubbling away. Men nodded a greeting and didn't bother to ask whether Alex would make an appearance. Jimmy had gathered up his barked ropes the previous evening, and now he laid them beside the tarring pots, ready to get to work. Tarring was a mucky business, and Jimmy's least favourite part of the herring preparations. He was keen to get it over with. To protect his hands, he rubbed them with butter, then began the slow process of dipping long lengths of rope into boiling tar. Taking care not to burn himself, he couldn't avoid the splattering of tar as he dipped and removed miles of rope. By the time he finished, he had been at it for hours, and black splodges covered his body and clothes. He walked down to the shoreline and began rubbing salty water over his hands and arms. But the damn stuff clung to his skin like limpets to rock. The sight of tar-splattered men became a familiar sight over the next few days, as the preparations rolled on. Men prepared their equipment and began painting the keel boats which had lain idle all winter. From the herring yard came hammering and sawing. The coopers had arrived, crafting mountains of barrels for storing and exporting fish. Ships appeared, bobbing lazily on the calm water of the harbour, their crews unloading large quantities of salt and barrel staves. Strangers arrived, incomers, some of whom the locals recognised from previous years, others for whom this was their first time following the Silver Darlings. Boat launching down day arrived. All the work had been leading to this moment. Villagers eagerly awaited this special day, which brimmed with anticipation, excitement and hope that a good season lay ahead. As islanders gathered at the harbour, everyone lent a hand in getting the cumbersome keel boats down and into the water. There were over 20 boats, and the work took all day. As the last boat slipped down, cutting through the still water and sending ripples across its surface, the assembled crowd let out a loud cheer and a cry went up. "Drink!" Islanders scurried to the village, womenfolk to their homes, men and boys distributed between the many island pubs. Each skipper had contributed to the kitty, and the landlords were ready and waiting for their thirsty patrons. "Why can't we have a drink too?" asked Clara. "It's not the way of things here," Anna said, and handed Clara a small glass of gin. Clara swallowed it down, the liquid burning her throat and making her wince. Anna laughed. "You're supposed to sip it, Clara." Anna topped up her daughter's glass, and although Clara didn't like the taste, she accepted the offering, more out of principle than anything else. If the lads got to have a drink, so would she. Several hours later, the sounds of a fiddle and loud singing floated down through the night air and into their cottage. Anna got up and looked outside. "I think they're down at the harbour. Want to go?" Clara grinned and jumped up from her seat. The two women followed the sounds of music and voices, finding quite the gathering by the harbour side. There were other women down there that Clara didn't recognise, and she realised these must be the herring girls, all the way from the Scottish Highlands. Bill spotted his wife and daughter in the crowd. "Come to join the party," he slurred cheerfully, and pulled them further into the throng. The air filled with shouts and raucous singing, the high spirits infectious. Clara smiled in amusement as old John drew Anna into a dance. Chapter 16. June 1910. Jimmy was leaden with tiredness by the time he made it home. The incomers were a lot of fun, and several of the herring girls had persuaded him to dance. The memory of dancing with Clara made him smile. She had whooped and hollered as he'd galloped her round to the old fiddler's tune, hair flying behind her like a veil, and eyes bright with joy. As he'd pulled her closer, he caught the faint smell of liquor on her breath, and realised the child he had always known was becoming a woman. Their eyes locked before her hand slipped away from his, and she swirled away into the arms of Bill, who twirled her round till she was giddy. Jimmy settled down in his chair and pulled a blanket over himself. He fell into a deep sleep, the fiddler's tune still playing in his head. Jimmy woke with a start as a heavy object landed in his lap. With one eye open, he saw Marnie bouncing around, determined to wake him from his slumber. He grunted and closed his eyes, but she had her hands on his shoulders, shaking him. "Are ye going to catch the Silver Darlings today? Jimmy! Jimmy! Wake up!" Jimmy stretched his arms above him and yawned, pulling Marnie closer and resting his head on hers. "I hope we catch some, but not till tonight, so I was hoping for a longer rest."
He shut his eyes, the warmth of his sister lulling him back to his dreams. "Why are you going tonight? Are the fish sleeping now?" There would be no peace, so he lifted his sister off his lap and stood up. He buttered himself a hunk of bread and stood out in the fresh sea air, hoping it might rid him of his drowsiness. The island streets were quiet. Jimmy envied the fortunate souls still tucked up in their beds. The day passed, crawling through the seconds, minutes and hours with a frustrating lethargy. By lunchtime, Jimmy wondered if the evening would never come. But come it did, the sun slinking down, scattering hues like rose petals on the water of the harbour. As the pink water turned black, the fishermen gathered atop the hue. There was a reverence, a pause in the excitement which had characterised the previous weeks. They faced out to sea, eyes trained on the horizon, searching for clues that the silver darlings were nearing their shores. Jimmy yawned, drowsiness shrouding him. He longed to lie on the mossy grass and close his eyes. A yell pierced the quiet night. Jimmy's eyes flung open as he snapped alert. Sleep banished till the morning. "There," said Bill, aiming his large hand at a point on the horizon. The other men followed the line of his arm with their eyes, hoping that Bill's assertion was correct. Jimmy held his breath, squinting out at the water. A smattering of silver, like the Milky Way, glittered on the dark water. Men scrambled down the rocky bank, lured by the glimmering silver. With a half-drunk skipper and an inexperienced crew, Alex's boat was last to leave. They hoisted the red sail and followed the line of drifters disappearing toward the horizon. The island was nothing more than a small dark speck on a vast expanse of navy water by the time they brought the sails down. "Shoot the nets, lads," said Alex. The men began flinging nets overboard until they hung like curtains over the murky depths below. The corked edges bobbed on the undulating waves, and the boat drifted over the water. Alex pulled out a hip flask and took a glug. It seemed they would be a man down by the next morning. The crew settled down in the hull and alternated between sleep and lookout duty. Jimmy stirred as his back caught on a hard piece of wood and opened his eyes to a fluorescent dawn sky, shades of pinks and oranges splintering as they hit the choppy sea below. He looked around at the sleeping crew and pulled himself up on the gunwale, peering over its side. "Lads," he called. "Lads, stir yourselves." One by one, the crew joined Jimmy. With no sign of the nets, a ripple of excitement passed through the crew. "Skipper!" called Robert. He picked his way across the boat and shook Alex. All he received in return was a loud snore in his ear. Robert tried again, but this time he received a sharp left hook before Alex slumped back down and resumed his snoring. Jimmy took charge. "Let's get the nets in, lads." It took all their strength as they heaved the nets from their sunken position. A good omen, thought Jimmy to himself. As the waters parted, the men could see a squirming mass of scales appearing like an apparition below. Hollers and cheers went up as the men took in their bumper catch. The noise woke Alex from his slumber, and he staggered over to see what was happening. He slapped the crew on their backs and slurred congratulations before slinking back into his drunken stupor. They drew the nets over the roller on deck, and the crew shook them out, spilling hundreds of silver fish onto the deck. Their muscles strained with exertion as the dead weight of the net inched up and over. It was back-breaking work, and the crew barely had time to wipe their brows. But spirits were high, the sounds of singing and chatter filling the air. Hours passed before the catch was in the boat. When the last fish were in, they collapsed, exhausted, taking in the abundance of silver darlings with awe. Jimmy took a swig of water and lifted one fish above his face. He gave it a good smack on its lips, causing the other men to roar with laughter. Once they had caught their breath, the men hoisted the sail and started for home. No man was idle. Those not attending to the sails or tiller were busy scooping their squirming treasure into baskets, ready to hand to the herring girls who were waiting on the shore. They pulled into the harbour, where most of the boats had already returned. It had been a good catch all round, and it was a jovial scene that greeted them. Baskets moved from the boat to the herring houses with no time to spare, for the gutting and salting could not wait. Accepting the offer to join the crew, Jimmy headed to the Fisherman's Arms, where he settled himself on a stool and took a swig of ale. He smiled at the crew, as Alex claimed credit for their successful outing. The men clinked their glasses with Jimmy's. They knew the true skipper that day.